So let's get to animating this squash and stretch. Now, I have my squash and stretch set up. I have the deformation in place. And if your intuition told you to mark the first keyframe, advance the playhead, select the squash and stretch and modify something like the factor, and record the keyframe, watch what happens. We scrub the playhead, nothing happens. Okay, I think your instinct feels right. That would be kind of an intuitive way to do it. But let me just share with you the reality of what happens with recording the keyframe in time. And I'll demonstrate this with just a real simple cube. I'm going to mark that position, and I'll advance the playhead. I'll change the position of the cube. I'll also kind of flip this around in a couple of different directions according to its rotation, and I'll mark that keyframe. Now when I advance the playhead, I have it rotating and moving, and I actually have it moving according to all three axes, right? Because I didn't restrict its motion to one axis when I moved it. And so what was recorded there when I clicked the record button is the position, the scale, and the rotation. In other words, if I were to jump in my timeline, so I go to Window, Timeline, and I look at the animation applied to the cube, I could actually dig in, look at the position. I'll look at Y, and I got a curve going on in the Y position. I got a curve going on in the X position, and same thing with the Z. Okay, and if I go into the rotation, I got a heading change, an H rotation, that's for heading. I have a pitch rotation, and I also have a bank rotation, so I'm rotating in a couple of different directions. When I click on this record keyframe button, it's only recording the position, scale, and rotation of that object. Now there's what we can do is we can record the parameter, or we can make parameter keyframe recordings, and we have to be a little bit more precise about that. And to demonstrate this point, I'll go into the cube, and anywhere in Cinema 4D that you see a little bullet next to a parameter, that is something that you can animate over time. Okay, and let me just demonstrate this point. If I want this cube to change its size over time, and I don't want to scale it, I just want to change the X size, I could do this a couple of different ways. The easiest thing to do is we want to record the keyframe on whatever frame our playhead is set on. So we'll just start on frame 0. And if I hold down the Option key, the Control key on the Mac, Control-click on the bullet inside that parameter, it turns red. And what we've done is we've just recorded on frame 0, we've recorded that parameter equals 200. When I advance the playhead, like any other recipe of the animation, I'll change the value. I'll hold down the Control key and click on that element. I've just recorded that keyframe of the size X at 665 centimeters. Now when I scrub the playhead, watch what happens. Okay, so that value of X increases over time. So, and as you start to look around Cinema 4D, any attribute in the attribute manager that has this little hollow bullet, this little keyframe next to it, that is something that can be recorded and changed over time. So let me review that really quickly. And actually, before I do, let me use this as an example to pop open the timeline. And so now when I look at the cube animation, not only do I have position, scale, rotation, but I also have size. And if I look at size, the value of X of the cube object is being changed over time. And look, it itself has a curve as well. So, and just like our previous presentation, if we look at that, there's a scale value here, and that size changed roughly to just north of 650, from 200 to 650. And again, I could take that element and I could actually modify that. So now that's going to get longer. Okay, so it's pretty cool. I'm going to delete this cube, and let's just take a look. If I go into squash and stretch, or really anything inside Cinema 4D, if it's got a bullet there, that's something that can change over time. Okay, now think about it. If I'm trying to modify something, if I have squash and stretch, and I say, okay, well, I want to click this record keyframe, and I expect it to record all of those parameters by default. Cinema 4D is going to have to track a huge amount of data with all of these objects, with all the parameters, with all the deformations. This goes for any object that we create. So in other words, if I create a spotlight, as an example, look at all that stuff. Everything next to it has this keyframe, this bullet next to it, which means that we can change that stuff over time, which is very cool. It opens up a huge amount of opportunities for us, and we'll explore those in this class. But for today, what I want to do, or during this presentation, is simply get this squash and stretch to change over time. So here's the technique. I have my playhead positioned. I'm going to find the expand, and I'm going to control click. Excuse me, wrong one. Control click on factor. I'll advance the playhead to frame, let's say 30, and I'm just experimenting now, and I'll squish that down. I'll control click on that bullet. Okay, and now as I scrub the playhead back and forth, that value changes. So I'll advance to frame 60. I'll increase the factor back to roughly 100%, and I'll control click on that bullet. Now there's another way to do it. If I advance the playhead, kind of the long form of doing this will be to advance the playhead. I could change that factor, and rather than control clicking on that bullet, I can right click or control click on the item itself, choose animation, add keyframe. Okay, it's doing the same thing. Control clicking on the bullet is the equivalent of right clicking on an element, choosing animation, add keyframe. Okay, so you can keyframe just about anything, and I'll just rewind the playhead and hit play, and there's the basic squash and stretch animation as applied to this sphere just sitting in space. Now, during the next presentation, what we'll do is we'll take the squash and stretch, add it to our existing animation, our bouncing ball animation, and get that ball to squash and stretch as it should over time as it impacts the ground. We'll catch up in the next presentation.